With us today via Zoom, we have Nels Johnson with the Nature Conservancy. We're going to hear from him first, and my job is to advance his slides for him. So hopefully I can hold up my end of the bargain there. And then Aditya Ranade with 2 Degrees Adapt is joining us today as well. So I will let them introduce themselves as they come up or come on the microphone or the speaker. So Nels, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you just fine, David.
All right, we can hear you as well. So I'll turn it over to you if you want to introduce yourself, and then give me the cue when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, and great to be able to join you at least virtually today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Again, I'm Nels Johnson. I work for the Nature Conservancy in our North America Climate Program, where I co-direct our renewable energy strategy. So let me just say a few words about the Nature Conservancy. You may know us mostly as a conservation organization. We've protected sensitive lands, important conservation areas across the United States and around the world for going on 70 years now. And we have increasingly recognized the importance of addressing climate change as part of our mission in terms of conserving all life on Earth. And so we've increasingly focused on ways in which we can contribute to that battle against climate change. We do a couple of things. One is we work with what we call natural climate solutions, which is to store more carbon in natural ecosystems, forests, grasslands, wetlands, but also in agricultural systems. And then increasingly, we've turned our attention to clean energy technologies and the build out. We've have a long history of doing land use planning. And when we became more and more aware of what the scale of the build out is to get to net zero carbon emissions by mid-century, it became increasingly apparent to us that land use planning is really a key issue in terms of getting that build out in place in ways that we can hopefully avoid and minimize conflicts and impacts as we build out. So I'm going to address kind of that build out challenge with a project that we've been working on for the last few years in several different iterations called Power of Place. What is really exciting about Power Place is we don't mean it to be the answer. They're scenarios, they're not predictions. So they give us a sense of what the trade-offs of different approaches are to getting to net zero. What's really exciting is we think this approach and the data that we've used to do this can be adapted for different geographies and for different questions that we haven't gotten into in lots of detail here. And Audie's going to be following my presentation with an example of that for Nebraska, which I think is really exciting, which is looking more specifically at the interaction of agriculture and clean energy. So next. So the build out challenge, I think you all know how big of a challenge this is, but we're only a little ways into the build out of all the renewable energy we're going to need to get to net zero. Wind and solar technologies require more land than a number of the technologies they're replacing. And because that scale of infrastructure is so widespread, it does pose the risk of conflict over environmental, social, and land uses. We've seen that in a growing number of localities around the country where there are moratoriums or setback restrictions that are making it more difficult to build wind projects, solar projects, and other things that we need to get to net zero. And we view that as one of the biggest risks of the build out is the conflict that could be generated as we advance the build out over the next several decades. So next, so the Power of Place approach has been designed to look at, what are the ways in which we can get to net zero? What are the land use impacts? What are the impacts to natural areas and wildlife, to prime farmlands, and to local communities? And the way we've done that is we've worked with decarbonization modeling, really sophisticated energy modeling, And then we've applied different social and conservation constraints to the model. So kind of limits where the model can select things to areas that have lesser impact. And then we can analyze what the differences are with what we call siting as usual. In other words, the kinds of approaches that we've used in the past, which haven't been as spatially explicit as we've been trying to do here. So next. So as I mentioned, we've done a series of these analyses. We first started a proof of concept of this approach in California back in 2019. That was right after California became the first state in the country to make a legal commitment for reaching net zero by mid-century. Then last year, we expanded it to the rest of the Western United States because we have a number of Western states also making net zero commitments. And then as the nationwide commitments are starting to mount across the country, and of course with the recent policy enactments of the Inflation Reduction Act and Inflation and Jobs Act, we see more and more nationwide interest in the build out that's coming. So we released the nationwide report in May of this year, and that's mainly what I'll be sharing with you today. So next. So common to all three of these approaches, we've used decarbonization modeling. We've worked with some of the most advanced energy modeling consulting groups out there. We work primarily with Evolved Energy Research in these last two, the West and the nationwide studies. Previously, we worked at E3 in California. We also have as partners Montero Mountain Energy and the University of California at Santa Barbara. And then important for this audience, we have worked with American Farmland Trust to get a better understanding of kind of agricultural impacts and what some of the possible ways of minimizing impacts can be and ways of generating more benefits on the agricultural side. Next. So I won't get into lots of detail here, but there are basically several steps that the power of place approach kind of takes for trying to avoid and minimize impacts from all that infrastructure that we're going to be building over the next 3 decades. Just one way to kind of think of this is, we can do different approaches to decarbonization. For example, we can go all renewables, or we can do a mix of renewables and certain other technologies like nuclear and hydrogen and gas with carbon capture. Those different pathways have different land use implications. So that's one way you can look at reducing impact. Another thing that we think is important, regardless of what portfolio of technologies you're using, is to use environmentally and socially social data that can be geographically explicit. So you can build that into your planning as you're looking at different ways of getting the build out implemented. Once we have used that information to kind of inform energy modeling, then we can look at other things like shifting between technologies. So, we can switch from more land intensive technologies to less land intensive technologies. So, for example, wind projects, at least when it comes to the project area, are larger than solar projects. So you can make that shift. And then within technologies, we can reduce impacts by looking at land saving kind of approaches to those technologies. So one example would be what we call agrivoltaics as an example of a land saving approach when it comes to solar deployment in agriculture, where you raise the panels up so that you can conduct agriculture, at least for certain kinds of crops, on that same land, even as you're generating energy there. So next. So the central message we've come through in all three of these studies is that, in fact, we can get all the clean energy infrastructure we need to get to net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050 and avoid most, not all. We are inevitably going to have impacts to sensitive natural and working lands. But right now, about half of all renewable energy is going into natural areas or prime farmlands. And so we think we can reduce those impacts if we plan for it now. The power place approach has used a scoring system, so we can look at how do we reduce impacts. Here we go. From where we are today, which is at 0%, that's siting as usual, we're calling it. And then as we take more account of these environmental and social factors in terms of deploying clean energy technologies, what you can see on the left is where we're reducing the land area needed. So we estimate that an area something the size of Texas would be needed to accommodate all the projects of wind and solar and transmission and other technologies to get to net zero. But as we constrain the model to avoid impacts, it's finding solutions that require less land. And by the time we get to, say, a 70% impact in impacts, we're seeing an area just half the size of Texas being required to accommodate all that clean energy. What you can see on the right is how that manifests itself in terms of the portfolio of technologies. So basically what's happening is we're seeing somewhat less onshore wind and more solar. We're also seeing more battery storage and other storage. And we even see a little bit more nuclear as we get to really reducing impacts. We're really trying hard to reduce impacts, spatial impacts. We end up adding some nuclear. It doesn't select a lot because nuclear is, at least in the data that we have for existing nuclear and what limited data we have for small modular, just doesn't make it very economic compared to wind and solar and storage. Next. This is just a way of showing you what the challenge is in terms of how much the build out needs to increase over the next several decades. On the left is just renewables for electricity generation. So that's not economy wide. That's not assuming we're electrifying transportation or heavy industry. It's just the existing kind of electrical generating fleet. But if we go to economy wide and we go to the next middle one, we have to increase the build out at 4x the current build out rates in recent years. So that's just an enormous lift. That's involving all technologies. So that assumes that there's existing nuclear, there might be some new modular nuclear in the future. It's hydrogen, it's some gas with carbon capture. And then on the right is what happens in terms of the build out if we only use wind and solar to get to economy-wide decarbonization. And that's a build out expansion of 8 times recent build out rates. So just really a big challenge. So, and that's why these land use considerations, environmental and social impacts, are so important to be trying to minimize because of this need to really ramp up our build out. Next. One interesting finding is that it doesn't have to cost a lot to reduce these impacts. We find that it does cost somewhat more. We found it's about 6.3% more to reduce impacts by 70% compared to recent trends. We think that's fairly modest, especially when you consider we're not accounting for soft costs that may be higher for projects that are going into places that have more of a risk of environmental or social impacts. That means, there can be higher cancellation rates, longer permitting times and permitting delays. There can be higher monitoring costs and project design costs and other things that may offset that 6.3%. So we think that's actually a fairly modest increase in costs that we should be considering as part of getting the build out de-risked from the kind of impacts that can generate conflict. Next. One thing that is really important, we all know how important transmission is. I mean, it's a huge constraint to getting to net zero, to getting all that wind and solar and other technologies online and to markets. When we reduce impacts from the generation side, we've seen a corresponding decrease in the amount of transmission infrastructure we need. We still need a huge amount, something like 2.5 times what we have today, but That's less than 3.5 times that we estimate it might require if we do siting as usual. So we see both a reduction in interregional transmission gigawatt miles, as well as the gen-tie lines that connect wind and solar projects to the grid. Next. So one thing I know is interesting to this audience and this part of the country is agricultural impacts. We actually find that the impacts of the renewable energy build out to prime farmlands is relatively modest. And as we reduce impacts for natural resources and other social impacts, we also see some reduction in impacts to croplands, including prime croplands. Just so you know, the prime croplands that we defined here is actually using an index that the American Farmland Trust, which is kind of defined the spectrum of agricultural productivity and resiliency, and we used a threshold number that they recommended we use to identify those prime farmlands. So next. So of course, the United States is a huge country with lots of diversity in terms of energy resources, including renewable resources, in terms of environmental resources, and in terms of social politics, everything else. And so we kind of broke the national findings into these regional pieces. On the right here of the graph, you're seeing the breakout for the north central part of the country, I guess what we call mid-continent north, which includes Nebraska. You can see wind is just a hugely dominant renewable energy technology for that part of the country. Solar is significant, and it will probably become more and more significant over time. But wind is just really an unparalleled resource in the north central part of the country, along with parts of the south central part of the country. You can see by contrast, the southwest and southeast are really tremendously dominated by solar. And so that just re-illustrates how important that interregional transmission is for moving energy around so that we can reach places where, the solar isn't always able to shine. And so we need wind from the Midwest or the Great Plains. And likewise, we can move solar to places where the wind isn't blowing that are dominated by wind. So next. So I'll just leave you with a few recommendations that we think are important to try and keep in mind. We believe it's important to have kind of an all clean energy technologies approach to getting to net zero. We need so much of everything that we shouldn't be limiting ourselves by taking technologies off the table. We think as long as we can have net zero outcomes, that we should be looking at the full range of possible technologies for getting to net zero. We think it's really important to plan for nature and people at all levels. We think it's important to start thinking of energy planning kind of the way we've done transportation planning. We do it at all sorts of different levels, and it's very much built into local planning, it's built into state planning, and of course the federal government is also very engaged. And so we think there's some value in thinking about, how do we do that at all levels for energy as well. We think because of those regional differences I just shared with you, it's important to think about what incentives work best in different parts of the country and won't be the same every place. We think it's also really important to give projects that are in lower impact areas that have less risks in terms of environmental or social impacts to get a permitting advantage or get an advantage in the interconnection queue because they have less risk of being canceled or delayed. And so we think that projects that are in the right places should be prioritized. We think it's really important that we do clean energy development different with communities than we did earlier forms of energy development, where communities are really not part of the conversation, not very engaged in planning and thinking about what kind of benefits communities wanted out of it. It's really important, we think, in terms of the social license to make sure that there is adequate opportunities for communities to engage and define benefits they want to get from the energy projects that are being built in their vicinity. And then again, transmission is just hugely important. And we think, especially at least at the national level, these interregional connections are really important. And we think we should look really hard at existing infrastructure. How do we use, for example, existing utility rights of way to reconductor, use more highly efficient cabling to replace the old steel cabling? What about transportation rights of way? Can we use those for transmission so that we don't have to spend so much time trying to get new right-of-ways aligned, and we know how long that can take. So are there ways that we can make it go faster if we use existing infrastructure as much as we can? We will still need to build some new transmission right-of-ways. And I'll leave you with that. The last slide just shows some resources you can find at our website, nature.org, Power of Place. There are these different slide decks and more details you can find that can take you deeper into some of the highlights I shared this afternoon. Thank you.
My name is Ranade, and I work for 2 Degrees Adapt. Our mission is making climate resilience actionable, and land use is a key part of that. So we use climate modeling to evaluate different kinds of land uses. In case of this study, we were honored to be supported by Nature Conservancy. So really the central question here is renewable energy, as we all know here, preaching to the choir a little bit, is key to climate change mitigation. Yes, there are other options, but this seems to be sort of the least controversial option. But it does require a lot of land. This morning we heard from SPP about the very large queue of renewable energy. That's great news. MISO similarly has a significant queue as well. Closer home to Nebraska, all major utilities here, they have their own goals for net zero emissions, electricity, somewhere close to mid-century. But we have to bear in mind that Midwest is a very, very key center heartland of U.S. agriculture. So this graph represents dollar value. And if you want to take a snapshot at 2022, Nebraska crop ag value is $22 billion in 2022. So incredibly important to Nebraska's economy, culture. So we are in a situation where we are looking at farmland as a new battleground for renewable energy. And I have some personal experience with this. Before 2 Degrees Adapt, I ran the energy division for the state of Minnesota, where prime farmland and utility scale solar and wind were often perceived as being in conflict. And we have seen other examples of this, where a large 400 megawatt solar project has been put on hold in a county in Ohio. So what we take a rather different view of this. We don't see those two as necessarily being in conflict if we use weather and climate modeling to find areas of a state where there's going to be significant climate burden on crop yields. There will be some places where there will be a climate boost on crop yields, right? So by using modeling and data, we can understand how these decisions can be made in a data-driven way, county by county. So the approach that we take is we model climate variables that are key for crop yields, such as temperature, precipitation, water availability, and then we turn that into predictions of crop yields. So I'm showing an example here from a neighboring state, Iowa, Tama County. So the black line is our predicted yield. Of course, climate has a lot of variability, so we model multiple climate models, an ensemble, if you will, 20 different models. So we not only look at the average outcome, but we also look at the range of possibilities here. So the yellow line is how the yields would grow because of, biotechnology, improvement in farming practices, if we didn't have any climate change. Black line is the impact of climate change. So you can see the difference between the black and yellow line is what we call climate burden. And keep this term in mind because we're going to look at how that changes for Nebraska and county by county. So we turn that into crop economics, and that helps us identify alternative land use where crop agriculture may be less profitable in the near future. And those could include conservation, carbon sequestration, of course, solar and wind. So what were the conclusions of our study? Let me tell you that first, and then we'll show you how we got there. So by mid-century, we're going to see temperatures in the state that will be significantly warmer. So the temperatures that the presentation from SPP mentioned, 110 Fahrenheit, for example, those won't be extremes anymore. Extremes of today will become norms in future. And this would be concentrated in the southern counties that are already hot. Climate change will also impact crop water index. This is the difference between how much water a particular crop like corn and soybean demands through evapotranspiration and how much you actually get through precipitation. So this is going to have a major impact in central Nebraska, leading to more irrigation. So yields would continue to rise. There will be improvement in biotechnology, farming practices. There will also be some beneficial heat that we take into account. But there will be significant climate burden on yields, nevertheless. So we think because of lowering costs of solar and wind, they're already competitive with fossil fuels. They'll present even greater cost savings by 2050. So by focusing on counties with high climate burden in Nebraska, this capacity could be unlocked. And there's plenty of low impact capacity available, an order of magnitude than the current installed capacity. If we go the route of agrivoltaics, we may not need to choose between the two. And we're going to show an example of how that could be done. So here's our approach to agronomic modeling. So we do take into account technology improvements by looking at a time term. So we look at the previous 40 years of history, county by county. Then we project forward growing degree days and failing degree days. So growing degree days means, what is the beneficial heat above a certain threshold? And failing degree days is how much heat do you have above a threshold where the reproductive function of the crop is hindered? And of course, that is different for every crop. So for example, corn is 86 Fahrenheit. If you take, say, sorghum, it is 90 Fahrenheit. So it's very crop specific. And then crop water index, as I alluded, is there enough water available? And we actually differentiate here between rain-fed and irrigated crops too. So as Nebraska summers dry, we're going to see an increase in crop water needs. Basically, a warmer atmosphere demands more water from the same soil and same crop. And we project that forward on a county by county basis. We take into account variations in crop calendars. And we look at the difference between how much the atmosphere is demanding from the crop and how much is available through precipitation. So how does this sort of look county by county? So historic crop water index is shown on the left, and projected change by mid-century is shown on the right? So, and this is just for agriculture land. So we have taken out urban areas like Lincoln, Omaha, water bodies, etc. So we see that the largest increase in crop water needs is concentrated in central Nebraska, where we're projecting an extra 80 millimeters or 3 inches would be needed. What about the damaging heat? So again, as summers get hotter, and the reason I'm talking about summers is, most of Nebraska's crop ag is corn and soybeans, right? So not much winter wheat here. So in Kansas, it's a different situation. We have analyzed Kansas too, actually, this morning. A study that we did for Environmental Defense Fund on Kansas agriculture and crop water needs came out. But because summers are getting hotter, the crop damaging heat might nearly double. So we're here showing historical failing degree days for corn on the left, 1981 to 2020, and then how the mid-century climate is going to shift and with respect to that baseline. So it's really an increase throughout the state, but I would say the maximum amount of that increase is concentrated in that southern 1/3 of the state. So if you look at, zooming in to one county here, and we have all this data available on a county by county basis, and in the near future, you will see a very nice story map from Nature Conservancy, where you can go and click on a county and see all these numbers, and that will help you, focus your attention on specific counties if you're a developer. So we can look at, for example, Buffalo County, both change in crop water index and failing degree days. So what does this mean in terms of yield? Because that's one thing that the farmers care about, is directly tied to profitability. And here, it's important to distinguish between rain-fed and irrigated. Irrigation can solve a lot of problems. Although, for example, if you don't have enough water available through precipitation, you can give more water. To some extent, irrigation can also compensate for increase in temperature. Of course, as our analysis in Kansas shows, irrigation sources and aquifers are also under pressure, so that's something to take into account even for Nebraska. So if you look at where irrigation dominates, central and western Nebraska has very high fraction of corn that is irrigated, 75% or more. As you go east, it becomes less and less. So we took all that into account and then calculated a burden, climate burden on corn yields. So except for some northwestern counties, the climate burden on corn yields is significant. It ranges from 4%, 8%, 12%. And if you zoom into a particular county, let's take the example of Lincoln County, and differentiate between rain-fed and irrigated, you will see that the burden is much higher for rain-fed corn versus irrigated. What does it mean? A farmer may have to choose between planting corn or not planting corn if they can afford to invest in irrigation, and if there are no restrictions assuming there are no restrictions on irrigation going forward. Again, within Kansas, we have seen 2 laws passed last year in the last session that will restrict withdrawals from Ogallala Aquifer. So this is something to keep in mind. So what does this mean in terms of solar and wind LCOE? Just like we analyze crop yields on a county by county basis, we projected forward how solar and wind LCOE would change by mid-century. So we looked at technology improvement using annual technology baseline assumptions from DOE, and we took into account geographic variation. We had already projected wind speed and solar insolation through our climate analysis. So we use those numbers to project it forward. So we see that solar is around 44, 48 dollars per megawatt hour, going down to 30, 36, and most of that decrease actually happening in that western slice. Wind, some of the most attractive wind resource in the country, very high capacity factors, so it's already in that $30 per megawatt hour range, going down into the low 20s. And in this case, the decrease happens in the western and southern regions of the state. And as Nels alluded, the power of place analysis, we actually took that data and looked at county by county how much capacity is available without harming critical ecosystems in Nebraska and habitats. And our conclusion was that there is plenty of capacity available. Altogether, 66 gigawatts for wind and 800 gigawatts for solar. Now, wind is much lower cost than solar, but it's a bit more intrusive than solar. That's why the available capacity for solar is higher when you start taking into account ecosystem protection. But the message is that the current capacity for Nebraska, generation capacity, is 11 gigawatts, and even with intermittency and increased loads like heat pumps and electrification, we might see that number go higher, but there's plenty of room here to grow. So we have shown that utility scale solar that doesn't interface with agriculture at all could be located preferentially in counties that have high climate burden, but there's also an opportunity for solar and agriculture to coexist. So we just did a case study on, can we use on-farm agrivoltaics? So different type of analysis than what you saw in the preceding session, the analysis from Susan Opperman and others. So they were analyzing utility scale solar. Here we are analyzing smaller systems, 2, 3 megawatt, primarily for on-farm use. And we asked ourselves the question, in counties like Phelps County, there's going to be significant increase in crop water needs and irrigation fuel costs. What if agrivoltaics could be used towards that? And what does it mean in terms of farm economics? How much area would that need? So we looked at a tracker stilt mount design. In those of you that were in the agrivoltaic session, you heard the impact of increasing the height of the panels, increasing the gap between the panels, and the cost. We use numbers from NREL that show 26% higher capex and an increase in area. So obviously, the dollars per megawatt hour is not as attractive, but it's still very, very economical when you compare it to diesel costs. So even in 2020, you're looking at significant fuel cost savings. 18,000 for diesel versus 12,000 for solar-powered irrigation. And fast forward to 2050, even if you assume a very gradual inflation for diesel, you're looking at 48,000. Because remember that crop water needs are increasing, so you're going to need more fuel for irrigation, more energy. Solar costs would also rise because you just need more. But remember, LCO is falling, so that helps. So now you're looking at a much larger differential, 48,000 versus 13,000. So this results in significant net income improvement. Of course, you can look at other uses of agrivoltaics, such as powering on-farm equipment. And this doesn't take a whole lot of area, about 2.2 acres. And at this level, for a 1,000 acre farm, the hits on the yield are not significant to impact net income. So basically, our conclusion is that farmers ought to view agrivoltaics and conventional solar as an opportunity to cut irrigation and equipment fuel costs. County officials that are looking at pressures on water availability and stagnating yields, significant climate burden on yields, they should consider solar and wind leasing on farmland that would be rendered marginal in the near future to protect and enhance their tax base. And this type of quantitative information indeed could be used by Public Service Commission to prioritize utility scale renewable projects in counties with high climate burden and or pressures on crop water needs. So that concludes my presentation, and Nels and I are happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you. So we do have about 10 or 15 minutes left. Anybody have questions for Nels or Addy?
Given your analysis on the use of water for corn, should we be looking at other crops to grow in the future, and what would they look like? And given our conditions and practices now for growing that particular crop may need to change in the future, is there something in the future that we think we should be doing?
Yeah, no, very, very important question. Although we didn't do this analysis for Nebraska, we have done a similar analysis for Kansas, and that study just came out this morning. This one was sponsored by Environmental Defense Fund, and we have shown that by changing the crop mix between now and 2050, we can cut down crop water usage by 10 to 12%, while maintaining the same acreage under agriculture and getting the same nutrition out of that acreage. And the three or four crop switching cases that we use towards that are corn to sorghum. Sorghum has similar uses, and particularly Kansas has a rich history already of doing that switching. So we're just recommending more of it. And then there's winter wheat to rye and oats, and soybeans to millet, proso millet. And actually Nebraska has done a lot more than Kansas as far as millet. There's actually some great research at UNL and a company, Dryland Genetics, that I'm very, very familiar with. So yeah, those types of crops would consume much less water. You'll get same or maybe more nutrition per acre. There's that challenge of developing a market for those crops, but I think that's a wonderful opportunity to maintain the agricultural economy here while staying within the water budgets of mid-century.
Thank you. Other questions?
Does your solar production model decrease solar output with the higher temperatures in the future?
Yes, we do take that into account, but the temperature increases are not as significant. So that there are other costs that are falling. For example, financing and land acquisition costs. So they negate that output decrease.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, how significant do you think would be for Nebraska to have a statewide climate action plan? And what are the odds of it happening?
I think it's immensely important. Now, I'll plead ignorance on whether that. I know that individual cities have done that. For example, I know Omaha has one. I'm not sure if a statewide or maybe they have a plan to make a plan. Lincoln has one, but yeah, I think it's incredibly critical, and that it focuses on land use and adaptation as much as mitigation. The climate action plans that I've seen, including the one from Minnesota, primarily emphasizes decarbonization and mitigation. And I think if Nebraska builds one, my hope would be that they spend as much time on resilience and adaptation and land use.
I do have one, Adi, and I think this actually came to my mind during Nels' presentation, but I think I was surprised there wasn't more in the future of rooftop solar and more urban installation of solar. And it seems like it, from what Nels was talking about with land use and what you're talking about with sort of offsetting the impacts on agriculture while developing more renewable energy, especially with solar, more urban development of solar, more rooftop solar in agricultural settings as well, would be a potential big area of benefit.
Yeah, the challenge with rooftop solar is costs have come down both for utility scale and, let's call it, rooftop solar, distributed solar. But costs have decreased much faster for utility scale compared to rooftop. And now it's not very obvious, if what are the levers for reducing rooftop solar costs. They're all financing now dominates the remaining rooftop solar costs, and maybe there are unique business models and state support that can reduce it. But yeah, I think if you just look at the past 10, 12 years and data from, say, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, just the decrease is much faster for utility compared to rooftop solars. So that would remain a challenge. You'll have to look at other uses of DER, for example, in contributing to, say, summer peak needs, and if there's a way for utilities to compensate homeowners for that. So a need for some new business models there to make it viable.
Any other questions?
Is that report available? Where will we get that report?
tnc.org/Nebraska climate, right? Okay, good question. Thank you for the plug for the Nature Conservancy. Please join me again in thanking Addy and Nels.